concept of emotions which has been developed by Scherer in the Geneva emotions wheel, and he says that there is a whole variety of emotions which can be grouped in a way as you see on the slide. So emotions are either negative or positive, and you either have control or low control about the emotions. Anger, for example, is a negative emotion where you have high control. Surprise is something positive, and you don't have much control over it. We usually go and see what emotions people feel when they think about paying taxes or when they file their taxes. And we also study incidental emotions. What are incidental emotions? Well, going back to Lerner concept of emotions, we find that usually when people take a decision, there is a conscious and perhaps also non-conscious evaluation of the situation. The characteristics of the option are important to understand why people take a certain decision and not something else. And also the characteristics of a decision maker, like the personality, subjective preferences, are definitely important. And we always knew that also the expected outcome, the expectations, the aspirations, etc., would affect the decision. When it comes to emotions, probably the current emotional state, emotions felt at the time of taking a decision, shape the decision process, the preferences which people take, and besides that, it's also the mood state which might be important in the decision process, like incidental emotions. So in other words, these authors, Lerner, etc., distinguish between three types of emotions. They say the current emotional state related to the decision issue is important. They are called integral emotions. But also the mood state, which is caused by whatever, can affect a certain situation. These are incidental emotions. And you would consider also the emotions which you feel in the future once you have taken a decision and experience the outcomes. So the anticipated emotions are important. Now, we try to consider all these thoughts in our studies on tax behavior. And the first approach was one where we studied incidental emotions. So in other words, we want to know whether people who are in a positive mood or in a negative mood, just because they are happy or not happy, and they have to do their filings, whether they are more compliant when they are in a positive mood or when they are in a negative mood or in a neutral mood state. So the first topic now is incidental emotions and their influence on tax honesty. And I will briefly mention three studies which we run. One in Germany, where we studied happy people and less happy people and their filing behavior. We were conducting two lab studies in Vienna. One is called the tax musical, where we manipulated the mood state and had people filing taxes afterwards. And the hypothesis which we pursued in these studies was that, imagine people are in a happy mood. They're just happy because the sun is shining or something nice happened to them. In this mood state, people are usually thinking positive. They are very overconfident, very self-confident. They take a risk. Nothing can go wrong. And we would therefore assume that in case of positive mood states, people are, well, less honest than when they are in a negative mood. In a negative mood, they may consider more the risk and the outcome. Therefore, the hypothesis is aversive incidental emotions, negative emotions, lead to higher compliance than positive emotions. And that's what we studied. First, in Germany, where we had the opportunity to send a link to taxpayers who got a letter from the tax administration, and 22,200 people used this link, responded to our invitation to complete an online survey on tax compliance and different attitudes, their satisfaction with the tax office, etc., etc. And the idea was that if people respond during a situation where they feel good, they would be less or indicate less tax compliance than when they are in a neutral or in a negative mood. So we used these weekend effects, you know, the effects where we show, there are studies finding that people, that you have weekend effects in when you look at this financial decisions on the stock market. Our assumption is that people are feeling more happy on a Saturday and Sunday than on Monday, when the work starts again, when they have to go back to work. So if this is true, then our hypothesis can be tested. We would find, if we confirm the hypothesis, that people who respond on a Monday or on a Tuesday, even on a Wednesday, would indicate higher tax compliance than people who respond on a Friday or Saturday or Sunday to our survey. And interestingly, exactly this is what we found in the German study. If you look here, you can see that tax compliance on the vertical axis is much higher on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then it goes down. So if people are asked on weekends whether they comply with the law, whether they are compliant with taxes, they would give you a more disappointing result. They are seem to be less cooperative. Now, well, is this really a huge effect? We have a sample of 22,000 people, and almost everything reaches significance in a statistical term. But you see already here that the scale which I used, which ranges from 1 to 5, is very amplified. Yes, so I don't know whether we can really believe this. And if you look at the scale from 1 to 5 now in the valid way, there is only a small difference, but it's significant. It's a significant difference. And it could be an indicator of what files to control when they are signed. On a weekend, you probably have more people cheating than when they complete the tax file during the working days. We wanted to know more about that, and we ran a lab study on it. The hypothesis was in this study the same, but we primed people with positive emotions. So people were shown pictures which are making people happy, or pictures which are aversive, which lead to negative feelings. In this study, you see here a couple of pictures of photos which we used, which have been tested by other colleagues as eliciting different mood states. And we run a tax game where people played over 9 rounds and paid their taxes. So they got an endowment, they earned money, they had to declare it, and then they either experienced an audit or not. That was repeated 9 times, and before starting a round, we showed them pictures, either positive ones over the 9 rounds or negative ones. And what we find in this study is again a confirmation of the hypothesis, namely that incidental emotions are affecting people's behavior, tax behavior. In this case, we have almost 300 participants. The effect of the pictures was confirmed, so the manipulation check was confirmed. And what you see here is that people who see adverse pictures, pictures eliciting negative emotions, are more compliant when they pay taxes in the laboratory than people who saw the positively stimulating pictures. So in other words, what we find here is that people, taxpayers, are more honest when they are in a neutral or in a negative mood state than in a positive mood state. Or let me say differently. When people are too happy, they are less cooperative. Now, it's strange because the results are so significant. Therefore, we wanted to run the study also in Vienna, and we manipulated in that case mood by playing music while people were filing their taxes in the laboratory. In one condition, we used Mozart. Yeah. And while people were hearing this, can you hear the music? While people hear this music, they had to file their taxes. In the other condition, we manipulated negative mood, like this. Again, this has been tested in previous studies as really eliciting different incidental mood states. Okay, so you can imagine people file their taxes, have different stimuli which manipulate their emotional state, so to say. And then we were looking at how much taxes they paid over the experimental rounds. In this case, we had 12 experimental rounds and 123 participants in the study. We had positive mood condition, negative mood condition, and a control condition with no music. And what we find in this study was that there is no effect. So in Germany, you have this strong effect. In Vienna, there is no effect. It seems even that there is a tendency that compliance is going up when they hear Mozart than the negative stimulating music. You see here, over the 12 rounds, there is not much difference. There is no significant difference. What you see here is that after round 4, after round 6, if you look at the horizontal axis, you see the rounds. After round 4, 6, and 11, we have an audit, and you see that the compliance goes down immediately after an audit in the next round, and then it goes up again. So you see a bomb crater effect, which you often see in the laboratory. Once people are audited, they are less compliant in the next round of rounds because they assume that the auditing probability is now decreasing. So, single emotions were not significantly different across the conditions, and there was no significant correlation between positive and negative valence and tax compliance. We repeated this study again by using movies to manipulate the mood state. And let me be a bit quicker here. Again, we have no difference. We have used a within subjects design, where people play over 8 rounds, pay their taxes, and then they have this emotion manipulation and play another 8 rounds, no difference. So the conclusion is we don't know. We don't know whether incidental emotions affect people's willingness to cooperate, whether they affect people's compliance behavior or not. So there's a lot of research to do. If there is an effect, it would be a really important information to the Minister of Finance, because one could really look at when taxes are filed and search with a certain strategy for cooperative and non-cooperative citizens. What is important in tax decisions are, however, integral emotions. And integral emotions are those which originate from the activity which you are doing. So it's really the object, paying taxes, filing taxes, interacting with the authority, which is important. Janina Inachescu and other of my colleagues were studying which emotions are relevant in the process of filing and paying taxes. So the idea was we need to first know what situations taxpayers encounter, and then see what emotions they might experience. And when we know that, we might reach a better understanding of compliance behavior. So what are the typical tax-related procedures and situations for taxpayers? That was the first challenge which we had to cope with. And the next one was which specific emotions are elicited during typical procedures and situations. So we had to start really from scratch to understand what's going on when you are dealing with taxes, from the beginning where you collect bills, etc., till the end when you file and get an audit and experience an audit and an audit result. So the first approach was one where we used focus groups to understand what taxpayers have to do. We invited taxpayers, self-employed people, and people from the tax administration to tell us about the different activities which you encounter while when doing your taxes. And we were also using different emotion theories to find out what qualities, what discrete emotions might play a role. And we were also asking these people in the focus group what kind of emotions they might experience when thinking, doing taxes. Now, in this study, we first found that the scenarios, the situations which you encounter can be from the beginning where you file taxes to where you go and take and ask for advice, for information, until you're trying to cheat, experience an audit, etc., etc. We developed 7 different scenarios which are related to taxes. And we found a variety of emotions which might play a role during these situations of doing taxes and deciding about compliance. So in this study, we developed a survey where we described 7 different scenarios with a positive ending or with a negative end. So for example, one scenario might be one where you call the tax office and ask for an information. In the positive version of the scenario, the wording was that you call them, you reach them, you get helpful information. In the negative scenario, you call them, you have to wait in the phone line, and then you get somebody who tells you something, but it's not really very useful, not really very helpful. They are not even interested very much in helping you. So imagine 7 different scenarios with positive or negative outcome, or in other words, a 7x2 experimental design by using surveys. And we ask people what they would feel, how they would feel in such situations, when they experience something like described in the scenarios. And we ask them also about whether they would be compliant or non-compliant. So we had more than 500 subjects in this study who were either randomly assigned to the positive condition or to the negative scenario condition. We had self-employed and employed people. And when they had read the scenarios, we asked about the valence of the scenario, the emotions and their compliance. We also asked them about whether they think the scenario is a typical one which they encounter, or whether it's something which they cannot identify with. So we wanted to know what's going on first. When people do preparatory accounting tasks, when they are preparing things, a tax advisor cares of all tax-related issues versus the participant administers all the documents. So in the positive way, you do the preparation and all is working quite well. In the negative situation, it's difficult, you don't want, you don't find some documents and so on. Then the filing task. After postponing tax issues, finally you do the filing, or you miss the time to do it, etc. You describe the filing task. In the third scenario, people encounter the authority. They talk to the authority and either get positive or negative support. And they get feedback about their previous tax files, and they either hear that they get a refund or whether they have to pay additional taxes because they had not paid enough in advance. In the fifth scenario, they receive an audit announcement, and either they have prepared everything and everything already and don't feel that it's a lot of burden, or they start now preparing everything for this audit. And they experience the audit in a positive or in a negative way, and either and they did some evasion in the seventh scenario, and this, well, non-correct filing was either detected or non-detected. Now imagine you read these scenarios, you say whether you identify with these situations or not, and what you would feel when experiencing these events. You see here the scenarios, a list of emotions which people came up with, and we asked about whether they would be compliant or non-compliant in these situations. The first analysis which we conducted with the results, with the data which we got, was an analysis of clusters of emotions. We did a smallest space analysis, so similarities of emotions, and found 4 categories of emotions are important. One is relief. the positive emotion. But when you talk about negative emotions, it's important to distinguish between anger and fear, but also self-blame is something different. Feeling guilty, shame, self-blame, as we call it here. So in the next steps of the analysis, we were looking at what scenarios elicit what emotions. And you see here, I have to explain this picture a little bit because we stay with it for a while now. You have the scenarios, either the negative wording of the scenarios or a positive wording of the scenarios. The negative outcome or the positive one. Can you see that? On the left side, it's negative. On the positive side, we have on the right side, we have the positive outcomes of the scenarios. And then in the rows, you have the different scenarios: preparatory accounting tasks, filing tasks, contacting tax authorities, feedback, receiving audit announcement, experiencing an audit, and evading taxes. What you see on this in these results is predominantly that when the outcome is positive, people feel relief. In the preparatory accounting task, filing task, contacting authorities, receiving, etc., it's always relief which you feel. And the least relief is felt when you evaded taxes. Even if the evasion was not detected, you don't feel relief. It's something which people are dealing with. They are not feeling comfortable with it. When the outcome is negative, you feel anger, especially when you're interacting with the authorities. You become angry. And anger is an emotion where you attack, where you go back to the object or the subject who causes anger. So contacting the authority and not getting the necessary information or experiencing an audit in an unfriendly way elicited strong anger, strong negative emotions. Fear is felt when you're experiencing an audit and you have not everything prepared as you should have prepared it. So receiving an audit announcement, experiencing it, and having evasion detected causes fear. And even if you think you're convinced that everything has been done correctly, you fear the authorities because you never know. So it's the uncertainty. Even if you try to do everything in a correct way, it's the uncertainty which causes negative feelings, especially feelings related to fear and anxiety. And with regard to self-blame, it's when you evade taxes, both in the negative and in the positive outcome scenario. So to conclude that positive emotions are high when tax documents are prepared, filed, and in case of useful contact and feedback from authorities. So you feel positive when you yourself achieve something, when you can attribute the success internally, but you feel also positive if the interaction partner, the authority, interacts with you in a positive way. Anger is usually caused by the authorities. When you don't get the right information, when you experience a negative audit, meaning that the auditor is rude. Fear is high when a situation happens, when you experience something which is an audit or comes to an audit, and you're not sure about the legal issues, about whether you've done correctly or not correctly your taxes. And self-blame is highest when you're not behaving according to the law, independent of whether your behavior has been detected or not. So, knowing this about emotions is not yet enough. What we know so far is that incidental emotions, these mood emotions or mood states, are probably related to decisions, are probably related to tax behavior, but we don't know whether the effect is really huge or big enough to be considered. We know that integral emotions are very much related to people's tax behavior and also to compliance. So knowing this, knowing also that anger, fear, self-blame and relief are the important clusters or categories of emotions, we try to insert them in the slippery slope framework. Now let me briefly say something about the slippery slope framework. When considering law and economic approaches to tax behavior, you find predominantly that the power of the authority is considered the educational tool. You as the administrator, you as the state have to control your citizens, and if they are not obeying the law, you punish them. This is power. From a psychological perspective, we would assume that trust is important. And trust is fueled by moral attitudes, tax morale, and attitudes towards the state. But it's also fueled by personal and especially social and societal norms, societal values. Fairness is important. Distributional fairness and procedural fairness are of paramount importance. And people's personal characteristics, as we call it, also the motivational postures, are relevant. So when reading the different approaches in the different disciplines, you find that probably power and trust are the two dimensions which play an important role when you want to understand people's willingness to cooperate in the state. In that case, willingness to pay their taxes. And in this slippery slope framework, we assume that power of authorities can be very high, so the state is controlling every step of the citizens, or it can be very low. Fines can be very harsh or rather weak. If power of authorities is very high, then people cooperate because they are enforced to cooperate. So enforced tax compliance should be at the maximum if control and punishment are very high. On the other side, when citizens can trust the authorities, because the authorities are benevolent, act transparently, because they are fair to the citizens, and because also the other citizens cooperate, social norms are formed in a positive way. In this case, high trust would lead to voluntary cooperation. People don't consider, they don't take rational decisions to maximize their individual profit, but they just cooperate because it's the right thing to do. On the other way down, if trust decreases, also voluntary cooperation goes down. So if you want people to cooperate in the state, you have to combine power and trust. And if you combine it properly, so that power is high and trust is at the maximum, then you have high compliance, voluntary cooperation. Some may feel that they are enforced to cooperate, but people cooperate. It's at the top of this dice. If power decreases, if trust disappears, then compliance moves down this slippery slope and reaches a minimum. So we assume that you have to invest in both if you want citizens to be cooperate. You have to invest in power measures and you have to invest in trust measures. And we studied whether our hypotheses can be confirmed or not. We did many field experiments, we did lab experiments, we used surveys, we run these typical text games, etc. And what we find is that the combination of power and trust indeed leads to higher compliance. Actually, we run a study in 44 countries, and we found that power and trust combined leads to highest intended compliance. But interestingly, we also found in this study that in some countries, people would say, if my authorities were more powerful, if they showed more audits or controls and the punishments were more severe, then we would comply more. In other studies, people said, if we could trust the authorities, we would comply more. Make it clear. In all these 44 countries, we find that power and trust together has the strongest effect on willingness to cooperate. But in some countries, power is more effectful. In others, it's trust which is more effectful. It's always the combination which leads to a better effect. But in some countries, you need to invest more in trust. In other countries, you need to or could invest more in power to even increase the compliance. And interestingly, it seems like that in countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, in so-called poorer countries with less stable governments, with a less stable political situation, people say they would be more compliant if they could trust the authorities more. Whereas in the European countries, we found that people said, well, they would be more compliant if the authorities wielded more power measures, if the authorities showed more control and punishment was more severe. So this is still hypothetical, but it's the first result out of these studies. What we also found was that power has actually two faces. Power can either be perceived as coercive, so negative, or it can be professional power, legitimized power, which we experience. And if you talk about coercive power, the effect, that was our guess, is a different one on willingness to cooperate than when power is legitimized and professional. Our first hypothesis was that coercive power or harsh power has a negative effect on voluntary compliance. People act negatively to somebody who coerces them to do something, who punishes them. So there's a reactance which plays a role from a psychological perspective. On the other side, when power is perceived as legitimized and professional, then you're willing to cooperate. And in this case, power enforces even trust, and together compliance and willingness to cooperate increase. Coercive power, that was our first guess, leads to less willingness to cooperate, at least less voluntary cooperation. The results of our empirical studies led to inconclusive results. We found always that legitimate power is good, helps to strengthen voluntary cooperation, but coercive power sometimes as well. So sometimes people are more willing to cooperate, and trust is even increasing in the government or in the administration if they wield coercive power. So that's strange. But thinking about what we found in the studies on emotions, I think that we can at least speculate today that high trust and high legitimate power, together lead to voluntary compliance. And the process is such that high legitimate power, even if you experience that the authorities wields coercive power, leads to the impression or shows that coercive power is very well targeted towards those who exploit the society, towards those who are not willing to cooperate, towards those who cheat on taxes. Therefore, high trust, high legitimate power, together with high coercive power but well-targeted coercive power, leads to a feeling, well, first to a synergistic interaction climate, and to a feeling to be protected, to be secure, protected from exploitation by wrongdoers, and that fuels voluntary compliance. On the other hand, if you cannot trust your authority and you don't think they are very professional and legitimized, in that case, coercive power appears as non-targeted, but it's a threat to everybody in the country, to every citizen, the honest ones and the least honest ones. The climate is an antagonistic climate, and depending on whether you fear your authorities or you are angry about your authorities, you either fly, you avoid taxes in legal terms, but you're not cooperative, you avoid it, but you stay within the bracket of the law. If you're angry, you develop strategic behavior. You become selfish, a rational decision maker, and you try to evade if the possibility is positive, if the probability of being audited is rather low. So when you experience fear, you're not cooperative, but you stay within the bracket of the law. When your feeling is anger and prudence, you develop strategies to escape. Now, these are studies, these are hypotheses, still hypotheses, but in a recent study, in a huge field experiment with the US IRS, we were able to look at auditing behavior, auditing outcomes of many people and their future compliance. So in other words, imagine millions of American taxpayers, self-employed taxpayers, And these taxpayers all experience an audit, either a field audit, or an office audit, or a correspondence audit, just by exchanging letters. And the outcome is either a positive adjustment, they have to pay additional tax, or no adjustment, or they even get a refund. So, in experimental terms, we have a 3-by-3 experiment, 3 types of audits and 3 types of outcomes. We took a sample of thousands of audited taxpayers and matched this sample with non-audited taxpayers, and these non-audited taxpayers were taken from millions of self-employed American taxpayers, so that we had twins, audited and non-audited taxpayers. At the final end, we were able to look at the behavior of 1,300 audited and non-audited but well-matched taxpayers. And what we found in a survey and by looking at their future tax-paying behavior was that the emotions which people experience are similar as those in our Vienna study. It's fear, anger, caution, threat, or feeling of protection. And if they have the feeling that the authorities are trustworthy and they have legitimate power and exert coercive power in a well-targeted way to detect the cheaters, then they feel very protected. Whereas fear and anger and threat are low. If power and trust are low, you have all these negative feelings, very prominent, and a very low feeling of being protected. We also found that when people experience an audit which is not face-to-face, a correspondence audit, their attitudes towards the tax administration is deteriorating. They are less compliant in future years. Whereas if they experience a face-to-face audit, either field or office audit, they feel they are becoming more compliant in the future, even if they don't get a refund. So the idea which we have now is that, you see here in the first left column, that audit probability and fine are important to explain taxpayer behavior or willingness to cooperate in whatever organization. Knowledge is important. Attitudes are important, justice or fairness is important, and the behavior of other people is important, social norms. Audits and fines lead to coercive power. Whereas knowledge, attitudes, justice lead to legitimate power and trust. And now in the third column you see the resulting emotions are negative or the feeling of protection. And their outcome is either enforced compliance or voluntary compliance. Thoughts about cheating in the future or not. Now, we then try to categorize all these 1,300 people in different clusters, those who are feeling positive with the tax administration. So you have the positive, trusting people, the fearful, cautious people, and the angry people who feel enforced to be compliant. And what we found was that if you look at these different groups, is that after an audit, if people react to the interaction with anger, after the audit, you have more people in the cluster of the non-cooperative ones. If they are experiencing positive feelings during the audit, after the audit, they are positive also with regard to their future cooperation. So, in other words, we assume that audits with a positive adjustment, where people have to pay, and no face-to-face interaction, these people experience audits and fines very negatively. They react with anger, feel to be enforced to comply, and they think about strategies to cheat. If people experience no adjustment and have face-to-face interaction, they can talk to the auditors, they feel that the system is just. They trust, they feel protected, and react with voluntary compliance and spontaneous cooperation in the future. And those in the middle, which are not sure, are those which are experiencing fear and caution and try to become strategic, but within the brackets of the law. So in sum, I try to explain what our approach is to understand emotions and taxpayer behavior, and we distinguish between integral and incidental emotions. I was talking about integral emotions in the process of tax paying. I was also referring to these studies on incidental emotions with the unconclusive results. With regard to integral emotions, we find that positive emotions are related to self-achievements in tax scenarios. Anger is related to the authorities. Fear is related to threatening or announcing an audit. And self-blame is related to people's behavior which is not according to the law. We also find that negative attitudes, negative integral emotions, not incidental emotions, negative integral emotions are likely to affect attitudes and future compliance behavior, especially if people react with anger and experience an audit where they don't have direct interaction with the authorities. And the next questions, the next studies must go in our faculty in the direction to confirm the results which we have, which are more or less speculations, but confirmed or supported by several studies now, at least partially confirmed. And the practical question is, what happens in our countries generally if digitalization becomes more and more popular, and people don't even have the opportunity anymore to see the administrative stuff, when people have no direct contact anymore with the auditors, with the tax officers, but have to rely on what they read either on the screen, on the internet, or on the paper which they get. Thank you.
Это очень интересная перспектива исследования. Спасибо вам большое за внимание.
Спасибо. Мы знаем, что у Эрика всего время до 6 часов по нашему времени. То есть у нас 10 минут до завершения общения. Давайте 2-3 вопроса максимум. Есть вопросы? Сначала в чате есть?
Нет, в чате нет вопросов.
Тогда Алексей Корнеевский, студент методологии нашего института.
Dr. Kиршлер, guten Tag. Ich heiße Erich Kirschler, bin Student und danke schön für Ihren Vortrag. Ich habe eine Frage und werde Sie auf Englisch fragen, damit jeder verstehen kann. So my question is the part of your experiment with photos. I want to understand after you have shown the photos to people, photos which show them different emotions,
Did I understand correctly? You want to know whether after the photos we have tested whether people's mood changed?
Yeah, I understood, but I understand. But what was the procedure of measuring? How did you measure the behavior?
Okay. Well, in the first study, you refer to the incidental emotion studies. In the first study, we just looked at weekday and weekend effects, assuming that Sundays put people in a better mood. In the other studies, we did all manipulation checks. We were looking at whether the photos or the music or the videos which we showed them, the small films, whether they have really an effect on their mood. And in all studies, we found an effect. So the manipulation worked. Now, in the lab studies, we had people who had to work, different ones, but people had to work. They did these slider tests and they earned money. After having earned money, we said that they now have to declare the money. We manipulated the tax rate and the auditing rate and the fine rate, and we were looking at how much of the earned money they declared. That was done in Germany, and that was done in Austria as well. In Germany, you find that people declare less when they are put into a positive mood. In Austria, you find no effect. So that's the inconsistency which we still have to explain.
Okay, thank you.
But with regard to integral emotions, the effects are quite strong.
Спасибо, я вам сразу, да? Первый вопрос скажу короткий. Музыка играла всю процедуру исследования, включала перед принятием решения, после. То есть звуковой ряд сопровождал, и был ли он, то есть это было повторение музыки, если это было все исследование, или все-таки какое-то разнообразие, правильно было исследование, не могли ли люди просто помочь звуковому ряду?
I don't know whether that was a question to me or not.
Не работает.
Sorry. Did you have a question or not?
Yes, I have a question. I asked Erich about music in experiment. Are you listening? Are you hearing? Yeah? Do you hear?
We used music, yeah?
You use the music all export decisions about taxation, or before decisions, maybe after decisions, maybe all time.
No, we did the whole time, and it was well protected because people came to the laboratory. So imagine people are invited to do a tax experiment, they come to the laboratory, have to earn money and then to declare their income. And at the same time, in the neighboring room, we were playing this music, and we said, well, sorry, it's a bit noisy, but they are playing music over there. So we did not cheat. We just said that they are playing music. And that was the music which was in the neighboring room, but it was well heard in the lab where people, the participants were sitting. So this was done in order not to focus the attention on the music, but at the same time to manipulate mood.
Спасибо. И теперь главный вопрос. Now is the main questions about digital economy, about digital public administration, connection between regulation between power and between individuals without face-to-face meeting. Maybe it's not audit for individuals. When individuals think that all their decision is clear for regulation. Maybe it's not audit. Maybe it's full information. I pay taxes and I know that government knows how I pay.
Yeah.
They not check me, but they know. Maybe it's different for psychological factors. Maybe it's difficult psychological factors. What do you think about?
Well, first of all, Alexander, you have to know these are self-employed people, so small businesses, doctors, etc. All these people who in Austria and in many European countries have to declare taxes at the end of the year. It's not people who get a salary where taxes are source deducted. So they have more opportunities to cheat. And the law is not always very precise. So one of the biggest issues, not only for small enterprises and self-employed, but also for the bigger enterprises, is that they have legal uncertainty. And this uncertainty leads to interpretations, to questions, etc. What we find out is that people want to have certainty. It's not that they don't want to pay taxes. They want to be certain that they have done the right thing and can go and sleep well and in peace. And this is not the fact. Therefore, we found that fear is actually one of a very prominent emotion when people have to file taxes and receive an audit announcement, because even if they try to do everything correctly, they are not sure whether they have done it correctly or whether the auditor will insist that something needs to be done differently. Fear is important. And given that uncertainty and fear is so dominant, it is important that people have the possibility to get answers to their questions. Now, if you don't have contact anymore with the experts, with the auditors, with the people in the administration, you are never, you can read thousands of pages, but the law is still ambivalent sometimes, it's still fussy, and you are never sure. Therefore, I think both in the United States and in Austria and in Germany, we find that correspondence audits are not satisfying. People need contact, need somebody to explain. Otherwise, they remain unsure, they become suspicious, and if you're suspicious, you breed distrust. And that's why I say digitalization may be very effective, but are we as citizens ready for it? And how do you need to support getting clear advices, getting clear information? How do you do that when you digitalize all these processes even more than in the past?
Достоверную информацию, как они могут связываться с экспертами, специалистами, если вот мы в такой ситуации находимся?
Огромное спасибо, Эрик. Thank you very much for your lecture. It's first lecture. We call this lecture format named after Alexander Смирнов. It's my teacher in psychology. It's very good man. It was very good man. And it's honor for me the first of this lecture. It was lecture Erich Kirшлer. Thank you very much. And I think it's very useful result about face-to-face meeting with.
Эта лекция была посвящена Смирнову.
Taxes regulation. It's very important because we in Russia we saw in customs same situation in customs. When we make a digital platform for regulate transition goods from one country to another, many businessmen have a problem because they cannot ask questions all right, or they have mistakes and so on and so on. It's very useful results, and I think I'm sure that we can we start to understand this process much better after your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And happy anniversary again.
And I hope to see you in somewhere.
So do I. Thank you.
See you. Так, ну мы завершим. Не знаю, там кто-то слушает или нет. Хочу завершать трансляцию. Мы пока завершим здесь. Второй день. Как мы говорили, первый день был посвящен такому больше межстранновому взаимодействию, второй внутри системы, индивид, государства и бизнес. По-моему, все выступления, которые сегодня были про это. У каждого свои выводы по этому поводу. Что я хочу сказать? По-моему, для меня один из выводов сегодняшнего дня, что все страны, все ученые в меру своих возможностей и потенциала в принципе решают одну и ту же задачу. Это говорит о том, что, наверное, какие-то заделы в каждой языковой отрасли науки, там, германской, британской, российской, они разные. Какие-то исследования мы друг друга знаем, какие-то нет, где-то мы друг на друга опираемся, где-то идем своим путем, но сегодня это не имеет существенного значения, потому что мы решаем задачу одну, И решения этой задачи, по всей видимости, нет ни в Европе, ни в Соединенных Штатах Америки, ни в России. От китайцев мы не слышали, к сожалению. Вот, может быть, у китайцев есть, но будем исправлять, послушаем их в ближайшее время. Всем спасибо. Тяжелый был день, завтра он не легче. Вот, завтра начинаем в 10 утра круглым столом. И завтра у нас еще и запараллеленные сессии. Утром историческая психология, курс управления и круглый стол ЕАЭС перспективы для России. Круглый стол про ЕАЭС будет здесь, потому что больше очных участников. А круглый стол исторической психологии государственного управления будет в нашей основной аудитории центра 2221. Ну, мы завтра всех гостей разведем, кто на какую секцию с утра. Будет нам немножко хлопотнее, но поверьте, никто не ошибется. Все будут там, где они хотят быть. Спасибо. Как всегда, студенты задерживаются. Методическая часть. А гостям большое спасибо. Я думаю, что...
Да, коллеги, кого завтра уже не увижу, вернее, еще сегодня. Всем до свидания. Была рада приехать и пообщаться.
Вы завтра во сколько уже?
В 7:30, видимо, утра.
Утра?
Не любите вы себя.
Так я же думала еще там на втором. Майкоп.
Так вы сейчас в Майкоп или домой?
Майкоп. Вот сегодня решала. Поэтому и поняла, что да.
Поэтому и